Now that video games have well and truly entered the mainstream, we find ourselves at a really exciting point in time where there's a game of every sort of genre and for every kind of player. In general, this is a fantastic thing. It means chances are, no matter what you're after, there's a game out there for you. That said, for all the fantastical medieval adventures, engaging hero shooters, and everything in between, there have inevitably been a handful of games that certain people think went too far. Perhaps this was a government laying down a ban on a game for being too violent, a subsect of gamers declaring the game inappropriate for its themes, or dedicated fans with expectations who were so let down by a title, they walked away from it immediately and deemed it unplayable. Whatever the case may be in each of these instances, it's easy to say that somebody wasn't happy with these titles. I'm Just from WhatCulture, and here are 10 unacceptable video games. Number 10. Hatred. Starting off with one of the earlier games to cause a massive uproar for its content, we have 2015 isometric shooter Hatred. Perhaps because the world was becoming disturbingly aware of the wave of mass shootings, or just because its content was going to be controversial regardless, this is a game that puts you in the shoes of a mass murderer, so it didn't go down particularly well with many players or critics. The main character doesn't have a huge amount of justification for his unaliving rampage, except for his declaration that he, quote, just fucking hates this world and the human worms feasting on its carcass. In another cringe-inducing move, the game also encourages you to execute unconscious people as a way to recover health. Unsurprisingly, the ESRB hit Hatred with an adults-only rating, surprisingly only the third one they'd ever given out for violence. This rating prevented the game from being sold at any traditional retailers. Upon release, some dubbed the game unacceptably promoting violence, others claimed it was only shooting for shock value, and a couple claimed even if you overlooked those aspects, the game was actually fairly repetitive. In any case, this one certainly caused a stir. Number 9. My Lovely Daughter. Although Hatred is largely played from an isometric perspective, it plays like a traditional action shooter, which, given its themes, is naturally going to disturb some viewers. My Lovely Daughter, in contrast, sits closer to the strategy and visual novel genres, but that doesn't make its themes any less disturbing. Like a good amount of the entries on this list, this is another one that some claim is a masterpiece, while others think it should never have been made. My Lovely Daughter tells the story of an alchemist who wakes up only to discover his daughter has died. Unwilling to accept his circumstances, the grieving father decides to create a series of homunculi who he raises as his own daughters, only to kill them and harvest their souls to try and revive his deceased child. You'll also assign them jobs and grow a relationship with them before their inevitable death, and yes, that is as brutal as it sounds, especially since they all grow to love you before you murder them. Without spoiling anything, as the story progresses, you also begin to recover your memories of the fatal event and unravel precisely what happened to lead to your predicament. The cycle of murder is enough to have put plenty off the game, but those who can look past its nasty aspects are in for a treat. Number 8. E.T. the Extraterrestrial. Rebounding off that ball of depression, we have a game that was unacceptable for a totally different reason. E.T. Those in the know probably don't need any more explanation as to why this one made the list, but just in case you aren't, let me run you through it. This 1982 adventure game is commonly accepted to be one of the worst games of all time. Partially a victim of its own hype, the game was criticized for its gameplay, story, bizarre frequency of holes for our hero to fall down, and general crappiness. This was likely due to the extraordinarily tight turnaround demanded of the developers, but it didn't make the poor final product any more acceptable. In fact, the game was so badly received that a load of cartridges were discarded by Atari and buried at a Texas landfill. Though initial reports suggested the dumped video games were exclusively copies of E.T., this actually wasn't the case, though there were at least 1,000 copies of it in there, so it wasn't exactly flying off the shelves. Perhaps the worst thing we can say about this iconic disaster, though, is that it's attributed with contributing to the video game crash of 1983. Yikes. Number 7. Saya no Uta, The Song of Saya. While some of the games on this list are horrific but contain enough substance and intrigue to make them genuinely worthwhile experiences, a lot of people would claim Saya no Uta is not one of those games. It falls into the erotic visual novel genre, but it goes quite a bit darker than that. Essentially, some critics argued that this one is just shooting for shock value and is basically tragedy porn. You play as a medical student who wakes up after a car accident to learn he is the only survivor. In a gruesome twist, his head injury has rendered him unable to see his environment and those within it as anything other than gory piles of flesh and organs. In what initially seems like a reprieve, he meets a girl called Saya during a hospital stay. But she turns out to be a violent, murderous creature, so that's not great. The game really does have the whole kit and caboodle of horribleness, going all the way from sexual assault to flesh-eating. While the game has its fans, inevitably, as evidenced by its Steam reviews, there's no denying this exercise in repulsion and boundary pushing drew a lot of criticism. Number 6. Harvester. It's easy to dismiss Harvester as a goofy horror game peppered with gore and awkward FMV sequences that couldn't possibly be called unacceptable. But some of the scenes in it are beyond anything that even the gruesome games on this list have to offer. You awaken in a small town with no memory of yourself or anything else and are persuaded by the local cults to start executing some tasks. These often have pretty violent ends. Your unsettling journey devolves into a main narrative that features incest, manslaughter, murder, suicide, and themes of how a regular person can become a brutal killer. There's also a bit where you see supposedly joyous kids eating their ailing mother, so, that's a whole thing. Harvester has it all: unsettling themes, gore galore, nasty set pieces, and a wildly disturbing narrative. It also has a cult following, so if it is your kind of thing, then good for you, but you'd find yourself in some decent level of company if it isn't. Number 5. Manhunt II. Given the uproar it caused, we'd be so remiss to write this list without including Manhunt or its sequel. Whether you agree with the inflammatory response to the game or not, it's undeniable that this one made waves, to say the least. The initial cut of Manhunt II received an adults-only rating, restricting it from sale and essentially banning the game, until it was edited so it could achieve an M rating instead. Rockstar's series is, at its most basic, a murder simulation, riddled with violence and gore, and there are many ways you can execute and maim those unlucky enough to meet you throughout the game. Even though the graphics don't hold up particularly well for you to be able to understand what a big deal this was, those who played it at the time will be able to tell you. Manhunt II was initially seen as unacceptable because some claimed it was connected to a murder in the UK that happened at the same time, while others were appalled that the original received a sequel at all. Activists campaigned against it and tried to get it classified a public nuisance. Government officials tried to have its M rating reinstated as AO, and in Australia the game was never even submitted for reclassification, rendering it banned. Speaking as an Australian though, that one's kind of classic Australia for the time. Number 4. KZ Manager. In what is almost certainly the most appalling game on this list that should never have been made and absolutely deserves its ban, we have KZ Manager. Or moreover, we do not have KZ Manager. In a bizarre case of who on earth funded this one and even let it get made, this is a 1990 game that basically lets you run a Nazi concentration camp. Yeah, really. Honestly, it's pretty much too sick to talk about and so completely unacceptable that I think we should just move on. Number 3. Anthem. Admittedly, there's not much to say about Anthem that hasn't already been said, but to make a list about unacceptable video games and not throw in this disappointing disaster also seemed like a huge oversight. So here it is. Now, the main thing that made Anthem so unacceptable isn't its dull story, repetitive gameplay, or even its unfinished nature. What made it especially bad is that it's made by EA and BioWare. That is to say, there's no reason Anthem should have been this bad. In the year 2019, after so many fan-favorite slam dunks from the developer and publisher, it was unthinkable and, in retrospect, unacceptable that a AAA game could arrive this broken, disappointing, and borderline unplayable if we're going by how many players couldn't be bothered to persist with it. Now, we know Anthem is a mess, and from any other publisher or developer, it probably would have just been like a middle-of-the-road action adventure some people might have enjoyed, but coming from such prestigious creators, this was downright atrocious. Number 2, The Cat Lady. The Cat Lady appears to be fairly tame at first glance, especially compared to some of the other games on this list. But dig a little deeper into its themes and protagonists, and things are more than a little disturbing. We join our heroine, 40-year-old Susan Ashworth, on the brink of her decision to take her own life. This choice takes her down the rabbit hole as she meets a supernatural entity called the Queen of Maggots, who tasks her with going back to the real world and taking out a bunch of psychopaths. What follows is a point-and-click adventure laden with explicit gore, incredibly violent and depressing circumstances, and plenty of characters you would not want to meet in a dark alley. Or any alley, really. While the story revolves very specifically around the themes of death, suicide, and the most unsavory of people, there is resilience and hope buried in there too. As a result, this is firmly on the list of games that some would deem unacceptable, but one which you should seek out if you're open to what lies beneath its grisly, macabre and bleak facade. Number 1. Thrill Kill. And as these things go, we're rounding out with a game that absolutely exemplifies what we're talking about here. It wasn't acceptable, its concept was almost completely despised by everybody, and it was too grotesque to even be released. Ladies and gentlemen, Thrill Kill. So controversial that it was cancelled before it could even come out, Thrill Kill was a fighting game intended for a 1998 release that called upon those who got sent to hell to fight for the opportunity to be reincarnated by the Goddess of Secrets. So far, not so bad, right? Well, despite seeming like a Mortal Kombat ripoff, given you'd be working to fill a kill meter so you could unleash the titular Thrill Kill move, publisher Virgin Interactive were keen to further up the violent ante. That resulted in the game earning the first ever adult-only rating handed out by the ESRB, primarily due to violence and not nudity. The game essentially ended up being a violent gore fest with a series of erotic and strangely BDSM and kink-themed fighters that all had gory stories of how they ended up in hell. In short, mostly these fighters are largely naked and deeply messed up, so unsurprisingly, potential publishers like EA decided to back out, and the title was overcome by the distaste of its nature at the time of its planned release. In the years since, bootleg versions have found their way onto the internet and clearly hold an iconic cult status given the game's infamy. Whether or not the game deserved to be pulled, no one who cares about video games that push the boundary will forget about it anytime soon, for better or worse. That's the end of our list, but do let me know down in that comment section if you can think of any other video games that were deemed unacceptable so we can either avoid them or give them a cheeky look-see depending on your preference. As always, I've been Jess from WhatCulture. Thanks so much for hanging out with me. You can come say hi to me on my Twitter account if you want, where I'm at Jess McDonnell, but make sure you stay tuned to us here for plenty more great gaming lists.